Marcus Williams stood at attention outside the Grand Palace gates, his polished uniform reflecting the morning sunlight. At 24 years old, he had achieved something most people only dreamed of: becoming a member of the Royal Guard. The crisp blue fabric of his ceremonial uniform was adorned with golden braiding, and his chest bore the royal crest that symbolized his sworn duty to protect the crown and serve his country. But Marcus's journey to this prestigious position had not been easy. Growing up in the poorest district of the capital city, he had learned early that respect was something you earned, not something freely given. His childhood home was a cramped apartment above his mother's small bakery, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the sounds of traffic from the busy street below. His father had died when Marcus was only 8 years old, leaving his mother Sarah to raise him alone while struggling to keep the bakery afloat. Sarah Williams was a woman of incredible strength and determination. Despite working 16-hour days to support her son, she never let Marcus see her despair. She taught him that dignity came not from wealth or status, but from how you treated others and how you carried yourself through life's challenges. Every morning before school, Marcus would help his mother prepare dough and arrange pastries in the display case. She would tell him stories of knights and heroes, instilling in him a deep sense of honor and justice. School was difficult for Marcus, not because of academics, but because of the constant bullying he faced. His worn-out clothes and second-hand shoes made him an easy target for wealthier students. The worst of these tormentors was Derek Thompson, whose father owned several successful businesses in the city. Derek was everything Marcus was not: tall, well-dressed, popular, and cruel. He seemed to take pleasure in humiliating Marcus in front of their classmates, making jokes about his shabby appearance and his mother's modest bakery. The bullying reached its peak during their final year of high school. Derek had gathered a group of his friends around Marcus's locker, blocking his path to class. "Look what we have here," Derek had sneered, his voice carrying across the hallway. "The baker's boy thinks he's too good to talk to us." The other students had laughed as Derek knocked Marcus's books from his hands, sending papers scattering across the floor. Marcus had bent to collect his belongings, his face burning with shame and anger, but he said nothing. His mother had taught him that violence only bred more violence, and he was determined not to give Derek the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. After high school, while Derek went off to an expensive university funded by his father's wealth, Marcus took a different path. He enlisted in the military, driven by a desire to serve something greater than himself and to prove that his worth was not determined by his background. The rigorous training was exactly what he needed. Physical conditioning, discipline, and military protocol gave structure to his life and helped him develop the confidence he had always lacked. Military service transformed Marcus from a shy, insecure teenager into a confident young man. He excelled in combat training, strategic planning, and leadership exercises. His commanding officers noticed his natural ability to remain calm under pressure and his unwavering commitment to protecting others. When he completed his basic training, Marcus volunteered for the most challenging assignments, serving in peacekeeping missions and security details that tested his skills and character. During his 5 years of military service, Marcus distinguished himself as an exceptional soldier. He received commendations for bravery, leadership, and dedication to duty. His fellow soldiers respected him not because he demanded it, but because he earned it through his actions. He was the soldier who would volunteer for the dangerous missions, who would stay behind to ensure everyone else made it to safety, who would share his rations with hungrier comrades. The opportunity to join the Royal Guard came as a result of his exemplary military record. The selection process was incredibly competitive, with hundreds of qualified candidates vying for only a few positions. The requirements were strict, extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, physical fitness tests, and interviews with senior palace officials. Marcus approached each stage of the selection with the same determination he had brought to everything else in his life. The background investigation delved deep into Marcus's past, interviewing teachers, neighbors, and former military colleagues. What they found was a consistent picture of a young man of impeccable character, someone who had overcome significant personal challenges without becoming bitter or resentful. His old teachers remembered him as quiet but hard-working, always willing to help classmates who were struggling. His neighbors spoke of how he had continued to help his mother with the bakery even while serving in the military, sending most of his pay home to support her. The physical requirements for the Royal Guard were demanding, but Marcus's military training had prepared him well. He excelled in marksmanship, hand-to-hand combat, and endurance tests. More importantly, he demonstrated the mental toughness and emotional stability required for a position that demanded absolute reliability. The psychological evaluation revealed someone with strong moral principles, excellent judgment under pressure, and a deep commitment to serving others. The final interview was conducted by Captain Elizabeth Hayes, the commanding officer of the Royal Guard. She was a formidable woman in her 50s who had served with distinction for over 20 years. Her reputation for maintaining the highest standards was legendary, and many qualified candidates had been rejected after failing to meet her expectations. Marcus entered her office with nervous anticipation, knowing that this conversation would determine whether years of preparation had been worthwhile. Captain Hayes studied Marcus's file carefully before looking up at him with piercing blue eyes. "Tell me, Williams, why do you want to be a Royal Guard?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. Marcus had prepared for this question, but he knew that a rehearsed answer would not suffice. He spoke from his heart about his desire to serve something greater than himself, about the honor he felt in protecting the institutions that represented the best of their society, and about his commitment to upholding the values his mother had taught him. What impressed Captain Hayes most was not just Marcus's words, but the sincerity behind them. She had interviewed hundreds of candidates over the years, and she could distinguish between those who sought the position for prestige and those who truly understood the responsibility it entailed. Marcus's humility, combined with his obvious competence and integrity, convinced her that he possessed the qualities necessary to wear the Royal Guard uniform with honor. The day Marcus received notification of his acceptance into the Royal Guard was one of the proudest moments of his life. He rushed to the bakery to share the news with his mother, finding her as usual behind the counter, flour dusting her apron and a warm smile lighting up her face. When he told her about his appointment, tears filled her eyes, and she hugged him tightly, whispering how proud his father would have been. The training program for new Royal Guards was intensive, lasting 6 months and covering everything from protocol and ceremony to advanced security procedures and threat assessment. Marcus threw himself into the program with characteristic dedication, studying late into the night and practicing until every movement became second nature. He learned the intricate details of palace layout, the schedules and preferences of royal family members, and the countless protocols that governed every aspect of royal security. His fellow trainees came from diverse backgrounds, but they all shared the same commitment to excellence that had brought them to this point. Marcus formed strong friendships with several of his classmates, finding in them the same sense of duty and honor that motivated his own service. They supported each other through the challenging training, knowing that their success depended not just on individual performance but on their ability to function as a cohesive team. The ceremonial aspects of Royal Guard duty required particular attention to detail. Marcus learned to stand motionless for hours, maintaining perfect posture while remaining alert to potential threats. He practiced the precise movements required for changing of the guard ceremonies, ensuring that every step was executed with military precision. The symbolic importance of these rituals was not lost on him. He understood that he was now part of a tradition stretching back centuries, a guardian of customs and values that connected the present to the past. Graduation day arrived with appropriate ceremony and gravitas. Marcus stood with his fellow graduates in the palace courtyard, surrounded by family members and dignitaries who had come to witness the occasion. Captain Hayes delivered a speech about the honor and responsibility of Royal Guard service, emphasizing that they were now entrusted with protecting not just individuals, but the very symbols of their nation's identity and values. When Marcus received his Royal Guard badge and ceremonial sword, he thought of his journey from the poor district where he had grown up to this moment of recognition and achievement. The weight of the badge in his hand represented more than personal success. It symbolized the possibility that determination and character could overcome any obstacle. His mother watched from the audience, her face glowing with pride and joy that made all the years of struggle worthwhile. Now, 6 months after graduation, Marcus had settled into his duties with the confidence and competence that his training had instilled. His daily routine began before dawn with physical conditioning and equipment checks. He took pride in maintaining his uniform and gear to the highest standards, understanding that even small details reflected on the honor of his position. His fellow guards respected him for his professionalism and reliability, and his superiors recognized him as one of their most promising young officers. Standing at his post outside the palace gates, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed. The scared, bullied teenager who had once cowered before Derek Thompson's cruelty had grown into a confident, capable man who commanded respect through his actions and character. He had learned that true strength came not from intimidating others, but from protecting them, not from demanding respect, but from earning it through service and dedication. The irony was not lost on Marcus that he now protected the very wealthy and powerful people who had once seemed so far above his station. But he had also learned that nobility came not from birth or wealth, but from how one chose to live their life. His position as a royal guard was not about serving his social betters, it was about serving ideals and values that transcended individual differences. As the morning progressed and tourists began to gather outside the palace gates, Marcus maintained his professional demeanor while remaining alert to his surroundings. Children pointed at his colorful uniform and asked their parents questions about what he did. Elderly visitors shared stories of previous royal ceremonies they had witnessed. Young couples took photographs, capturing memories of their visit to the capital. Marcus took quiet satisfaction in being part of experiences that brought joy and wonder to people's lives. The transformation from bullied teenager to respected royal guard had not erased the memories of his difficult childhood, but it had given them new meaning. Every challenge he had faced, every moment of humiliation and hardship, had contributed to shaping the man he had become. The values his mother had taught him about dignity, respect, and service had proven more valuable than any material advantage his tormentors had possessed. Marcus understood that his story was far from over. Each day brought new opportunities to serve, to grow, and to prove worthy of the trust placed in him. He had learned that life was not about avoiding challenges, but about meeting them with courage and integrity. The scared boy who had once cleaned up scattered papers in a school hallway had grown into a man who stood guard over his nation's most precious symbols. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and Marcus prepared for another day of duty, unaware that his past was about to collide with his present in ways he could never have imagined. Derek Thompson stepped out of his expensive sports car with the same arrogant swagger he had carried since high school. Now 25 years old, he had grown into the kind of man his teenage cruelty had foreshadowed: wealthy, entitled, and completely convinced of his own superiority. His tailored suit cost more than most people made in a month, and his gold watch caught the sunlight as he tossed his car keys to the valet with casual indifference. Derek's life since high school had followed the predictable path of privilege. His father's connections had secured him admission to an elite university, where his academic performance had been mediocre at best. He had coasted through business school on his family name and his father's generous donations to the institution. Upon graduation, he had been handed a vice president position at one of his father's companies, a role he had done little to earn and even less to deserve. Success, such as it was, had only amplified Derek's worst qualities. The wealth and power that had shielded him from consequences in his youth now provided even greater protection for his increasingly reckless behavior. He treated employees like disposable resources, customers like inconveniences, and anyone he perceived as beneath his station with open contempt. His romantic relationships were shallow and transactional, based on what others could provide him rather than genuine connection or affection. Derek's business practices reflected his personal character. He had gained a reputation for hostile takeovers of smaller companies, deliberately targeting family-owned businesses that reminded him of the humble establishments he had mocked in his youth. He took particular pleasure in firing longtime employees and dismantling the personal touches that made these businesses special to their communities. To Derek, sentiment was weakness, and tradition was simply an obstacle to profit. The Thompson family empire had grown substantially under Derek's aggressive expansion tactics, but this growth had come at a significant cost. Former employees filed lawsuits alleging workplace harassment and discrimination. Environmental groups protested his company's disregard for ecological concerns. Community activists organized boycotts of businesses that had been acquired and stripped of their local character. Derek dismissed all criticism as jealousy from those who lacked his vision and determination. Despite his business success, Derek remained deeply insecure about his reputation. He craved recognition and respect but could not understand why these things eluded him despite his wealth and position. He surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, but he could not escape the nagging feeling that others saw through his facade of success to the hollow person underneath. This insecurity manifested as increasingly aggressive behavior toward anyone who failed to show him what he considered appropriate deference. Derek's visits to the capital city were frequent, often involving meetings with government officials whose cooperation he sought to purchase through campaign contributions and lobbying expenditures. He maintained a penthouse apartment in the most exclusive district, where he hosted parties for politicians, businessmen, and socialites who tolerated his company for the benefits it provided. These gatherings were characterized by excess and ostentation, designed more to display Derek's wealth than to foster genuine relationships. On this particular morning, Derek was in an especially foul mood. A business deal he had considered guaranteed had fallen through when the target company's board had rejected his acquisition offer. Even more frustrating, they had cited concerns about his business practices and treatment of employees as factors in their decision. Derek could not comprehend how anyone would choose principle over profit, and the rejection stung his ego more than he cared to admit. His appointment at a government office had gone poorly as well. Despite his family's substantial political contributions, the officials he had met with had been frustratingly resistant to his proposals for favorable zoning changes and tax incentives. They had spoken about public interest and community impact in ways that struck Derek as naive and impractical. He left the meeting convinced that these bureaucrats simply did not understand how business really worked. Walking through the government district toward his parked car, Derek's frustration mounted with each step. The rejection and resistance he had encountered challenged his fundamental belief that money could solve any problem and open any door. He looked around at the modest government buildings and public spaces, seeing them as symbols of the inefficiency and mediocrity he despised. Everything about the area reminded him of the middle-class values and ordinary ambitions he had spent his life rejecting. His phone buzzed with a text message from his assistant, informing him that another business contact had canceled their lunch meeting. Derek's jaw tightened with anger as he realized his day was falling apart. He prided himself on his ability to control situations and bend others to his will, but recent events had left him feeling powerless and frustrated. The sensation was so unfamiliar and unpleasant that it only intensified his bad mood. As Derek continued walking, his attention was drawn to the nearby palace complex. The historic buildings and formal gardens represented exactly the kind of traditional authority he had always resented. To his mind, hereditary privilege and ceremonial positions were outdated concepts that had no place in a modern world driven by merit and achievement. He particularly disdained the pomp and ceremony associated with royal functions, viewing them as expensive theater designed to distract people from more practical concerns. The sight of tourists gathering around the palace gates to take photographs and watch the guard ceremonies only increased Derek's irritation. He could not understand why people would waste their time gawking at what he saw as meaningless spectacle. The elaborate uniforms and formal protocols struck him as absurd anachronisms, expensive costumes worn by people who contributed nothing of value to society. In Derek's worldview, anyone who was not actively generating profit was essentially worthless. Derek's path took him directly past the palace gates, where a substantial crowd had gathered for the mid-morning changing of the guard ceremony. He pushed through the tourists with obvious impatience, muttering complaints about people blocking the sidewalk. Several families with children stepped aside to let him pass, but their polite accommodation only reinforced his belief that others should naturally defer to his obvious superiority. As he approached the formal entrance to the palace grounds, Derek's attention was caught by the royal guards standing at attention on either side of the gates. Their crisp uniforms and military bearing reminded him of the toy soldiers he had enjoyed destroying as a child. The idea that grown men would devote their careers to standing motionless while wearing elaborate costumes struck him as both pathetic and amusing. One guard in particular drew Derek's focus. There was something familiar about the man's profile and bearing that nagged at Derek's memory. The guard stood perfectly still, eyes focused straight ahead, his polished uniform and ceremonial weapons reflecting his professional training. Derek studied the man's face more closely, trying to place where he might have seen him before. Recognition hit Derek like a physical blow. The royal guard standing at attention was Marcus Williams, the same boy he had tormented throughout high school. The baker's son who had cowered before Derek's bullying was now wearing one of the most prestigious uniforms in the country. The transformation was so complete and unexpected that Derek had to look several times to convince himself his eyes were not playing tricks on him. The sight of Marcus in the Royal Guard uniform triggered a complex mix of emotions in Derek. Part of him was genuinely surprised that the timid, poorly dressed teenager he remembered had managed to achieve such a respectable position. But a larger part of him was offended by what he saw as Marcus's presumption in rising above his proper station in life. In Derek's mind, people like Marcus were meant to remain in service positions, not to wear uniforms that commanded respect and admiration. Derek's initial shock quickly transformed into the same cruel amusement he had felt when tormenting Marcus years earlier. The idea that his former victim was now playing dress-up in a fancy uniform struck him as hilariously inappropriate. He began to plan how he might remind Marcus of his true place in the social hierarchy, how he could strip away the facade of respectability and reduce him once again to the frightened boy who had picked up scattered books in the school hallway. The growing crowd of tourists provided Derek with an audience for the humiliation he was contemplating. He imagined how satisfying it would be to publicly expose Marcus as an imposter, someone who had no right to wear such a distinguished uniform. The Royal Guard position that Marcus had earned through years of dedication and sacrifice appeared to Derek as nothing more than an elaborate costume that could be stripped away with the right words and gestures. Derek's resentment was fueled by more than just memories of high school dynamics. Marcus's success represented something that challenged Derek's fundamental worldview. If someone from such humble beginnings could achieve a position of honor and respect, what did that say about Derek's own advantages and accomplishments? The possibility that merit might matter more than wealth and connections was too threatening for Derek to acknowledge, so he instead focused on finding ways to diminish Marcus's achievement. The ceremonial changing of the guard was beginning, with guards moving in precise formation to take their positions. Derek watched Marcus participate in the ritual with obvious competence and pride, and this display of dignity only increased Derek's desire to tear it down. He had spent years believing that people like Marcus existed only to serve people like himself, and seeing his former victim in a position of honor felt like a personal insult that demanded correction. Derek began to move closer to the palace gates, pushing through the crowd with increasing aggression. Tourists who had been peacefully enjoying the ceremony found themselves shoved aside by an angry man in an expensive suit who seemed determined to reach the front of the group. Several people complained about his rude behavior, but Derek ignored them, focused entirely on his plan to confront Marcus and remind him of his proper place. The irony of the situation was completely lost on Derek. Here was Marcus, who had overcome poverty and bullying to achieve a position of genuine honor and service, standing as a symbol of the values that Derek's wealth could never purchase. But Derek's narcissism and entitlement blinded him to any perspective other than his own wounded pride and desire for dominance. As Derek finally reached the front of the crowd, he found himself face to face with the man he had once terrorized. Marcus remained at attention, professional and composed, unaware that his past was about to collide with his present in the most public and humiliating way possible. The contrast between them could not have been more stark, one man who had earned respect through service and character, and another who demanded deference through wealth and intimidation. Derek felt a surge of anticipation as he prepared to shatter Marcus's moment of dignity. In his mind, the next few minutes would restore the natural order that Marcus's success had temporarily disturbed. He had no idea that his actions were about to set in motion events that would expose his own character in ways he never could have imagined, and that the bullying tactics that had served him so well in the past were about to meet their match in a man who had been transformed by years of discipline, training, and inner strength. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true nature of both men, and Derek Thompson was about to discover that the frightened teenager he remembered no longer existed. Derek Thompson stepped forward from the crowd of tourists, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished stone courtyard as he approached the palace gates. The morning sun glinted off his gold watch and designer sunglasses as he positioned himself directly in front of Marcus Williams, who remained at perfect attention in his Royal Guard uniform. The contrast between them was striking, the man of wealth and privilege confronting the man who had earned his position through dedication and service. Well, Derek said loudly, his voice cutting through the respectful murmur of the watching tourists. If it isn't little Marcus Williams, the baker's boy. His tone carried the same mocking quality it had possessed years earlier in their high school hallways, but now it was amplified by adult confidence and the security that wealth provided. Several tourists turned to look at the disturbance, uncertain whether this interaction was part of the ceremonial display or something more personal. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat as he recognized the voice that had haunted his teenage nightmares. Without moving his head or breaking his ceremonial position, he could see Derek standing directly in front of him, wearing an expensive suit and the same cruel smile that had terrorized him years ago. Every instinct trained into him during his military service and Royal Guard preparation told him to maintain his position and discipline, but the sudden flood of memories from his painful past created an internal storm of emotions. Derek noticed the slight tension that appeared around Marcus's eyes, the only sign that his words had hit their target. This small victory encouraged him to press his attack further. "I have to admit, Williams, you've certainly upgraded your costume since high school. Though I suppose playing dress-up has always been your specialty." He gestured dismissively at Marcus's pristine uniform, his voice growing louder and more confident as he sensed weakness. The tourists around them began to realize that something uncomfortable was happening. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people started recording with their phones, uncertain whether they were witnessing a public incident or some kind of performance. The formal atmosphere of the palace grounds made Derek's aggressive behavior seem even more inappropriate and jarring. Captain Elizabeth Hayes, observing the changing of the guard ceremony from a distance, noticed the disturbance immediately. Her trained eye caught the subtle signs of tension in Marcus's posture and the obvious hostility radiating from the civilian who had approached the gates. She began moving closer, her hand instinctively moving toward her radio to call for additional security if necessary. Derek continued his verbal assault, emboldened by Marcus's inability to respond due to his ceremonial duties. "Do you remember how you used to grovel on the floor picking up your pathetic books? I bet you're still the same scared little boy underneath all that fancy decoration." His voice carried clearly across the courtyard, and more tourists began to take notice of the confrontation unfolding before them. Marcus struggled to maintain his composure as Derek's words transported him back to those terrible days when he had felt powerless and alone. But something was different now. The years of military training, the discipline instilled by the Royal Guard, and, most importantly, the confidence born of genuine achievement and self-respect, created a foundation that Derek's words could not shake. Marcus realized with growing clarity that he was no longer the frightened teenager who had once cowered before this bully. "What's wrong, Williams?" Derek pressed, stepping even closer to the gates. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just trying to remember which way to bow when your betters are speaking to you?" He laughed at his own cruelty, the sound harsh and grating in the formal setting of the palace grounds. The crowd of tourists was now clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. An elderly gentleman stepped forward and said firmly, "Excuse me, sir, but this is inappropriate behavior. These guards are performing their duties." Derek turned toward the man with a sneer, his sense of entitlement flaring at being challenged by someone he viewed as irrelevant. "Mind your own business, old man," Derek snapped. "This is a conversation between me and my old school friend here. We're just catching up on old times." His dismissive tone and obvious disrespect for both the elderly tourist and the ceremonial setting revealed the depth of his character flaws to everyone present. Marcus felt a surge of protective anger at seeing Derek's disrespect directed toward an innocent bystander. This was no longer just about their personal history. Derek's behavior was disrupting a solemn ceremony and showing disrespect to the institution Marcus had sworn to protect. The realization strengthened his resolve and helped him focus on his duty rather than his past pain. Captain Hayes had moved close enough to hear Derek's words and assess the situation. She recognized the signs of someone trying to provoke one of her guards into breaking protocol, and she prepared to intervene if necessary. However, she also wanted to see how Marcus would handle this challenge, understanding that it was both a test of his training and an opportunity for him to prove his growth. Derek, frustrated by Marcus's continued silence and professionalism, decided to escalate his attack. "I suppose your mother is proud of her little boy playing soldier. Though I heard the bakery isn't doing so well these days. Maybe when you're done playing dress up, you can come work for me. I could use someone who knows their place." The malicious reference to Marcus's mother crossed a line that even Derek's previous cruelties had not approached. The insult to his mother ignited something deep within Marcus, but instead of the helpless rage he had felt as a teenager, he experienced a cold, controlled anger that sharpened his focus rather than clouding it. He realized that Derek had not changed at all. He was still the same cruel, insecure person who could only feel important by diminishing others. But Marcus had changed fundamentally, and that transformation gave him a power Derek could never understand. several tourists began expressing their disapproval of Derek's behavior more vocally. A young mother with children said loudly, "This is disgusting. Someone should stop this man." Her comment was echoed by others who were appalled by the public bullying they were witnessing. Derek's assumption that his wealth and status would protect him from criticism was proving incorrect. Derek, becoming increasingly frustrated by the lack of response he was getting from Marcus and the growing hostility from the crowd, decided to take more drastic action. "Maybe you need a reminder of how things used to work between us," he said, raising his hand as if to strike Marcus across the face. The gesture was designed to provoke a response that would compromise Marcus's position and validate Derek's sense of superiority. The moment Derek's hand moved toward Marcus, several things happened simultaneously. Captain Hayes stepped forward, her voice carrying absolute authority as she commanded, "Stop right there." The tourists gasped and several people shouted warnings. But, most significantly, Marcus made a split-second decision that would change everything. In one fluid motion, Marcus stepped slightly to his right, maintaining perfect military bearing while avoiding Derek's intended strike. The movement was so precise and controlled that Derek's momentum carried him forward off balance. As Derek stumbled, his own hand struck the solid iron bars of the palace gate with a sickening crack that could be heard clearly across the courtyard. Derek's scream of pain and surprise shattered the formal atmosphere as he cradled his injured hand against his chest. The force of the impact had driven his knuckles into the unforgiving metal, splitting the skin and sending shock waves of pain up his arm. His expensive watch had shattered against the gate, its fragments scattered across the stone pavement like glittering evidence of his humiliation. The crowd of tourists erupted in a mixture of gasps, nervous laughter, and applause for Marcus's skillful defensive action. Children pointed excitedly at the dramatic scene while parents tried to process what they had just witnessed. Several people were already uploading videos to social media, ensuring that Derek's public humiliation would be preserved and shared far beyond the palace grounds. Captain Hayes approached Derek with professional concern but obvious lack of sympathy. "Sir, you need medical attention for that hand, and you need to leave these premises immediately. Your behavior is completely unacceptable." Her tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and Derek found himself being efficiently escorted away from the gates by additional security personnel who had responded to the disturbance. As Derek was led away, clutching his injured hand and muttering threats and complaints that no one took seriously, Marcus remained at his post, his bearing unchanged except for the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth. The attempted humiliation had backfired spectacularly, and Derek had succeeded only in humiliating himself before a crowd of witnesses and cameras. The elderly gentleman who had first spoken up approached the gate and said to Marcus, "That was beautifully handled, young man. You should be very proud of yourself." His comment was echoed by other tourists who wanted to express their admiration for Marcus's professionalism and composure under attack. Marcus felt a profound sense of vindication and closure. The scared teenager who had once picked up scattered books was gone forever, replaced by a man who could face his demons with strength and dignity. Derek's attempt to drag him back into their old dynamic had failed completely because Marcus was no longer the same person who could be victimized and humiliated. The changing of the guard ceremony resumed with renewed dignity and solemnity. The tourists who had witnessed the confrontation seemed to have a deeper appreciation for the discipline and character required to serve as a royal guard. Marcus's handling of the situation had elevated the ceremony rather than diminishing it, showing how true strength could transform even the ugliest situations into moments of grace and triumph. As the morning progressed and news of the incident began to spread through social media and local news outlets, Marcus realized that his past had finally been put to rest. Derek Thompson's attempted bullying had backfired so completely that he had become a figure of ridicule rather than fear. The power dynamics that had defined their relationship in high school had been not just reversed but completely destroyed. Captain Hayes made a point of speaking with Marcus during the next shift change. "You handled that situation perfectly," she told him. "You maintained your dignity and your post while protecting yourself and the integrity of the guard. That's exactly what we expect from our people." Her praise meant more to Marcus than she could know, representing official recognition that he belonged in the position he had worked so hard to achieve. The incident marked a turning point for Marcus, not just in terms of his personal healing but in his understanding of his own growth and transformation. He had faced his greatest fear, the person who had once made his life miserable, and had emerged victorious not through violence or revenge, but through the strength of character he had developed over years of dedicated service and personal growth. Derek Thompson's humiliation was complete and public, captured on dozens of phones and shared across social media platforms where it would live forever as a reminder that bullying and entitlement eventually meet their match when confronted by genuine strength and dignity. Derek Thompson sat in the emergency room of the city's most expensive private hospital, cradling his injured hand while waiting for medical attention. The throbbing pain in his knuckles was nothing compared to the burning humiliation that consumed his thoughts. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained from his stumble at the palace gates, and his shattered watch lay in pieces in a plastic bag that the hospital staff had provided for his personal effects. The medical examination revealed that Derek had fractured 2 knuckles and severely bruised the bones in his hand. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes who had seen countless patients try to explain away self-inflicted injuries, listened with barely concealed skepticism as Derek attempted to spin his story into something that didn't make him look foolish. His version of events, in which he was the victim of an unprovoked attack by an aggressive guard, fell flat against the evidence of his injuries and the growing number of video recordings that were already circulating online. While Derek waited for his hand to be properly set and bandaged, the first social media posts about the incident were beginning to go viral. The videos showed clearly what had actually happened: Derek's aggressive approach, his verbal abuse of Marcus, his attempt to strike a royal guard, and his spectacular failure as he injured himself against the palace gates. The captions and comments were universally mocking, with viewers expressing admiration for Marcus's professional handling of the situation and disgust at Derek's bullying behavior. News outlets picked up the story within hours, recognizing its perfect combination of justice, irony, and visual drama. The headline, "Wealthy Businessman Humiliates Himself While Trying to Bully Royal Guard," appeared across multiple platforms, accompanied by the most embarrassing moments of Derek's public breakdown. His attempted attack on Marcus was analyzed and replayed in slow motion, highlighting how his own aggression had led directly to his downfall. Derek's business associates began distancing themselves from him almost immediately as the story spread. His reputation, already damaged by years of unethical behavior and poor treatment of employees, could not survive such a public and humiliating display of character. Board members of companies he was involved with received angry calls from shareholders who were appalled by their association with someone who would publicly bully and attempt to assault a member of the Royal Guard. The political connections that Derek had cultivated through expensive campaign contributions also began to evaporate. Politicians who had previously been willing to meet with him in exchange for his financial support now found excuses to cancel appointments and return donations. The optics of being associated with someone who had been publicly humiliated while attacking a respected member of the military were too damaging for any serious political figure to risk. Marcus, meanwhile, experienced a completely different kind of public attention. The videos that showed his professional composure and skillful defense resonated with viewers who saw in him everything that was admirable about public service and personal character. Comments praised his restraint, his dignity, and his ability to protect himself without escalating the situation or abandoning his post. He became an overnight symbol of how to handle bullying with grace and strength. Captain Hayes found herself fielding requests for interviews about Marcus from news outlets around the world. The Royal Guard's official position was to maintain their traditional discretion about individual personnel, but she made it clear in her official statements that Marcus's behavior had been exemplary and that the Guard was proud to have such dedicated and professional members in their ranks. The incident at the palace gates became a case study in how social media could amplify both shameful behavior and admirable responses. Derek's bullying was preserved forever in digital form, ensuring that his moment of cruelty would follow him for the rest of his life. Conversely, Marcus's dignified response became an inspiration to countless people who had faced similar bullying and intimidation in their own lives. Derek's business empire began to crumble almost immediately as the full scope of his public humiliation became clear. The hostile takeover deals he had been pursuing fell apart when target companies realized that association with him had become a public relations nightmare. Several of his own companies faced boycotts organized by groups who were disgusted by his behavior and treatment of the Royal Guard. Stock prices for Thompson family businesses dropped significantly as investors fled to avoid the negative publicity. Former employees of Derek's companies began coming forward with their own stories of his abusive behavior and discriminatory practices. The public attention focused on him by the palace incident gave these victims a platform they had never had before, and their testimonies painted a picture of systematic bullying and harassment that extended far beyond his teenage years. Labor lawyers began organizing class action lawsuits against his companies, citing the viral video as evidence of his character and management style. The psychological impact on Derek was devastating. He had built his entire adult identity around his wealth and power, using these advantages to intimidate and control others. The sudden reversal of fortune, in which he became the target of widespread ridicule and condemnation, shattered his sense of self and left him unable to cope with the new reality he faced. Marcus received thousands of messages of support from people around the world who had seen the videos of the incident. Veterans wrote to thank him for representing their community with such honor. Victims of bullying shared their stories and expressed gratitude for showing them that bullies could be defeated without resorting to violence or cruelty. Parents used the incident as a teaching moment for their children about the importance of standing up to bullying while maintaining one's dignity and values. The Royal Guard received an unprecedented number of applications from young people who had been inspired by Marcus's example. Captain Hayes noted that the quality of candidates seemed to have improved significantly, with many citing Marcus's handling of the situation as their motivation for seeking to serve. The incident had elevated the reputation of the entire organization and reminded the public of the character and training required to wear the uniform. Derek's mother, watching the news coverage from her home, felt a deep shame that her son had become such a public embarrassment. She had raised him with every advantage money could provide, but somewhere along the way, she had failed to instill in him the basic values of respect and kindness that should guide any decent person. The contrast with Marcus, who had overcome poverty and hardship to become a man of honor, was too stark and painful for her to ignore. Sarah Williams, Marcus's mother, watched the news coverage with tears of pride in her eyes. She had always believed that her son would grow into someone special, but seeing him handle such a difficult situation with such grace and professionalism exceeded even her highest hopes. The small bakery where Marcus had learned his first lessons about dignity and hard work was flooded with customers who wanted to meet the mother of the hero they had seen on television. The legal ramifications for Derek continued to mount as investigations into his business practices intensified. The public attention had provided the motivation and cover that regulatory agencies needed to examine his companies more closely. Allegations of fraud, tax evasion, and environmental violations that had previously been ignored or buried by expensive lawyers now received serious attention from prosecutors who recognized the political value of pursuing such a publicly reviled figure. Marcus was eventually invited to speak at schools and community organizations about bullying prevention and character development. His story of transformation from victim to hero resonated powerfully with young people who faced their own challenges and needed to see that circumstances did not have to define their futures. His message was simple but profound: true strength comes from within, and dignity cannot be taken away by others unless you allow it to happen. The contrast between Derek's downfall and Marcus's rise became a powerful narrative about the ultimate triumph of character over privilege. Derek had possessed every advantage that money could provide, but his lack of basic human decency had ultimately destroyed him when confronted by someone who had earned respect through service and sacrifice. Marcus had started with nothing but had built a life of meaning and honor through his choices and actions. Derek eventually lost control of most of his business interests as lawsuits and investigations revealed the full extent of his misconduct. His wealth, which he had always seen as a source of power and protection, became a liability as creditors and victims sought to recover damages from his various schemes and abuses. The man who had once seemed untouchable found himself facing financial ruin and social ostracism. The palace incident became a defining moment that revealed the true character of both men involved. Derek's attempt to relive his glory days as a high school bully had backfired spectacularly, exposing him as a pathetic figure whose cruelty had finally met its match. Marcus's response had demonstrated that the scared teenager Derek remembered no longer existed, replaced by a man of genuine strength and integrity. Years later, when people remembered the incident at the palace gates, they focused not on Derek's cruelty but on Marcus's grace under pressure. The bully had been forgotten except as a cautionary tale, while the royal guard who had refused to be intimidated became a symbol of how dignity and professionalism could triumph over hatred and entitlement. Marcus continued to serve with distinction, eventually rising through the ranks to become a training instructor for new royal guards. He used his experience with Derek as a teaching tool, showing recruits how proper training and character development could prepare them for any challenge they might face. His story became part of the institutional memory of the Royal Guard, a reminder that the uniform they wore represented values that were worth defending. The transformation was complete. The boy who had once cowered before a bully had become a man who could face any adversary with confidence and composure. Derek Thompson's attempt to humiliate his former victim had instead provided the perfect stage for Marcus Williams to demonstrate just how far he had traveled from those painful days in high school, and how completely he had become the master of his own destiny.